So welcome, bienvenue, bienvenue. While we're waiting for people to come into the room, my name is Dorothée Alexandre. Welcome again, welcome back. And for those joining us for the first time, bienvenue. So we're about 61 people online. We'll wait a couple of minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes to have more people join us, and then we'll start.
So welcome. My name is Dorothy Alexandre. I will be your moderator for this virtual summit. So if you are joining us for the first time, I invite you to, in the chat, put your name and what part of the country you're coming to us to join the Shockproof Our Community Summit. Slowly but surely, people are joining. So you're slowly seeing the number of participants increase, and we're going to formally start in a few minutes.
So welcome everyone, welcome. So we're about 67 people online, so I'll be starting in a few seconds officially because we have a great panel coming ahead, great discussions. And I guess we'll start now because I see the numbers are coming up slowly, but I know that more people will be joining us. So welcome again. Welcome back to those who are online with us, and welcome to those who are joining us. We're excited to welcome you to this virtual session of the Shockproofing Community Summit on emergent community responses during the pandemic. So my name is Dorothée Alexandre. My pronouns are she, her, and elle in French. I'll be your host for this virtual summit. As we said earlier this afternoon, we have such great conversations ahead. This afternoon was filled with a panel discussion live on stage. And this afternoon, we're going to have a program just for you, our online participants. So as you know, the Shockproofing Community Summit is a national event, and most of us joining today are located on traditional First Nations, Métis, or Inuit territories. We're grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, we recognize that land acknowledgements, like I was saying earlier, are not enough, and that we need to pursue what? Truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations.
So this afternoon, there are a number of panelists joining us and a moderator, Adélie Alban-Arena. She's from the Laidlaw Foundation, and a panel composed of Eileen Boisseau and Loli Rico. What are they going to talk about today? They're going to talk about what's necessary today in order to fill the gaps, everything that has to do to emergency management, and especially during a pandemic. The pandemic taught us many things. And today,
Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that we have simultaneous English-French interpretation available. Please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen to select your language of preference.
So it's a bilingual event. So please select the language of your choice on the globe icon on the Zoom icon. You can use French or English. So we're also offering subtitling services in French and English. So please click on the link that's in the chat, and it will enable you to open the subtitling in another on your phone, on your computer,
if you have questions
whatever
for the speakers,
you wish.
Please put them into the Q&A box, and our team will direct them to the speakers at the end of the session. And of course, that is if time permits. Now we have, in addition to the interpreter and the captioning team, we're fortunate to have a visual artist joining us today. She'll be creating a dynamic illustration of the panel conversation. So her name is Adriana. She will have her camera on, and if you would like to see her work as it progresses, you can look for the video feed among the panelists and pin it to your screen by clicking the 3 dots in the corner of her video feed and selecting pin. And at the end of the panel discussion, we will invite Adriana to present a visual interpretation of the panel conversation to the full audience. So welcome, Adriana.
So, hello, Adriana. How inspiring to be able to join art to the subject of today, everything that has to do with the fight against gender-based violence, because we know that art has a capacity to touch our hearts, to touch our minds and spirits, and to contribute to the transformation of our societies. So earlier I mentioned that we're in a safe space that we called Rave Space. So we're making a province. We have a commitment to each other. What does this mean? It means that the Shockproofing Communities Summit is an anti-oppressive and inclusive space founded on intersectional feminist values and a transformative justice framework. So we're asking that all in-person and virtual summit attendees to be respectful of the identities, experiences, and perspectives of others. So we're therefore asking that all attendees be treated with respect
If you
and
witness
care.
or experience harm or severe discomfort during the event, please email the address that you see right now on the screen. So you know, for us, that safe space is very, very important. And I believe that if you're here is because you believe in those values also, and we thank you in advance for doing so. So now I will turn it over to Aldeli to lead our session today. So Aldeli, welcome again, and it's up to you to go on with the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci, Dorothée. Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Disaster and Emergency Management Emergence Response virtual session. My name is Aldeli Albanreina. I am the Director of Grants and Community Initiatives at the Leila Foundation. And we're very happy to have so many of you joining at 4:30 p.m. So thank you again. In the chat, you know, as Dorothée had said already, but if you'd like, please share your name, your pronouns, and your territory or your location. If you know whose land you live on, add it as well. If you don't, there's a prompt in the chat by Melissa. Thank you so much. But nativeland.ca is a really great resource to find out where you live and whose land you're on, and to be able to also kind of align ourselves a little bit more with that solidarity that Dorothée was talking about. So before we start, I also want to do a land acknowledgement, also with the understanding that, you know, obviously we need to go beyond that, but it's still important to acknowledge the land that we're on. So I'm situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, which is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, which is signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And the Williams Treaties is signed with multiples Mississauga and Chippewa bands. So for me, what's really important as a Black person born and raised in Tiohtià:ke, which is also colonially known as Montreal, from Afro-Peruvian parents, I think it's really important to speak to nuances around settlerhood, around colonization, and our relationship to the land and its carers. For this reason, I always really gravitate towards a passage from the Blackness Between Us collective, and it goes like this. The land was stolen from indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans were brought en masse to build these cities. This is occupied indigenous territories of many nations, and these cities are built with stolen African labor and resources. One cannot be remembered without the other. We invite you into a tradition with us of acknowledging and remembering whose territory you are on, wherever you are in the Americas, from the North to the Caribbean and to the South. And also remembering and acknowledging that it was built with stolen African and Black labor and resources as well. So, we will begin. I wanted to provide a little bit of context to today's conversation. We have some really good panelists today. I'm really excited for the conversations and the chat that we're going to have, and also excited about some of the questions that will come through later. But over the course of the pandemic, the Canadian Women's Foundation worked with academics in the emergency management field to conduct research on pandemic emergency responses at the provincial and territorial levels. So researchers found that there was no evidence that a gender-based plus analysis had been applied in any of the pandemic emergency management and response plans of any of the provinces and territories. That means that none of the state-led responses to the pandemic considered the differential impacts of COVID-19 or their plans in a way that accounted for people's intersections. So that means that it wasn't accounting for race, for gender, for disability, for class, or any other social location. And thank you, Melissa, for putting the link to the research in the chat that I'm referencing. So one of the things that we also were kind of thinking about is risk assessment and emergency management plans across the country were also created without any due consideration for the complex lived realities of women and gender diverse folks, particularly Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, people who are queer and trans, those who are disabled, those who are living on low incomes, and or those who work in informal economy. People who have precarious immigration status, folks who are undocumented, and so many more who were really left to fend for themselves. So obviously this had disastrous effects with consequences, including unnecessary illness and death, economic hardships, mental health impacts, and skyrocketing rates of gender-based violence for people who already experience the most acute forms of oppression and marginalization in our society overall. So because of the failure to center those likely to experience the greatest harm, service organizations and community leaders are constantly stepping in to fill critical gaps when emergencies occur. So this also then creates the problem that it invisibilizes gendered and feminized labor and efforts during times of crisis. So to shed some light on some of these issues, we have an amazing panel who are going to share how they have led grassroots emergency responses to ensure no one was left behind. So I'm going to turn it over to Eileen for Eileen's presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ani, bonjour. I'm happy to be here. My name is Eileen Boissonneau. I am an Ojibwe from Matagami First Nation, located in northeastern Ontario, the Treaty 9 area. And we are also one of 49 communities of the Anishinaabe Nation. I work here in my community as the health director. I've also overseen the emergency management program, and crisis response program. I am a mother of 2 adult sons and a grandmother of 2 grandsons. So with the history of emergency management in my community, goes back to about the early 2000s when we started experiencing natural disasters that affected our community and its members. And back then, we did not really have anything prepared. So we started off by, first of all, ensuring that we did an emergency response plan, kind of just had like a base template of it, but then had to adapt it to our own communities, assets, and identify what our assets were, what our risk managements were, and go from there to further develop the plan. So this took many years to do, because we, at the time when we started doing it, was when we started experiencing, of course, what really came to, how it all came about was that we started experiencing natural disasters. So we knew that our community had to do something about it. So being involved with the leadership, engaging with the leadership and key department directors, that we started that way. And then we also did some training of our own. I got involved in accessing any training that was available for me. So this way it would educate myself so that I would know what to do in my community. And when it comes to natural disasters, we often think we might have the perfect plan, but then, you know, your plan will often be thrown out or thrown off key. But I don't look at that as a mistake making the plan. I look at it as, okay, this is like growing pains. We have to reassess it again, because we don't know what's going to happen when we face a natural disaster. So our community did have experience with some natural disasters. One was a entire community declaration where we had an evacuation in 2013. 2014, we had a partial state of a declaration that was declared for evacuating, which mainly was the most vulnerable people removed, because we only have one access road in and out. So that was the road that was kind of washed out. And then we had a CN derailment that affected our community. It was in our traditional territory. It affected the water, it affected the air quality at the beginning. And then 2016, when you live in the north, you never know what the winter weather is going to bring. So we had a really bad ice storm in 2016 where we had to declare an emergency again, because we had a lengthy power outage for the entire community. And then 2018, of course, in the summertime, we were always affected by forest fires. Then we had air quality advisory notifications that were distributed throughout the area, and it affected our community as well, where it was just filled with smoke for days. So when you have people living with respiratory illnesses, this really affects their health, and so we had to think of a strategy of how we can help these people to remain safe. First, we ask them kindly if they could stay indoors, but they do have to go on with their own daily business as well, which tends that they have to leave their home. And then when we, getting back to the emergency response plans, we knew that we had to kind of develop, I think the greatest thing that we learned from was the total evacuation in 2013, where we knew that, okay, by reflecting back on that entire whole week and a half, we decided, okay, how can we change and make it better? And knowing that, you know, with putting some culture into your plan is key, because it's important to, when you're displaced from your community, that you want to ensure that the least invasive interruption to your life is important for people who are not used to change. And so the elders were affected. and they like to practice their own traditional practices. So we kind of like, okay, we need to ensure that we have a space for people who want to practice their tradition, and just ensuring that families and children were taken care of. And and ensuring that the biggest thing was their medical needs as well, and mental health needs. So we went through a lot of trial and error. We really need to have support from your First Nations to have the transition of being displaced to excuse me, to not be so invasive. I'll leave it at that. I feel like I want to keep coffee. Low talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. I'm going to pass it over to Lily now for her presentation.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. And my name is Loli Rico. I work at the FCJ Refugee Center, which we are. I will speak a little bit who we are and how we respond with the community. We are an organization that we work with refugee claimants, people without status, and victims of human trafficking, and from international cases, more focused on labor exploitation. In our organization, we serve people in different parts. We have settlement programs. We have a house that we accommodate women and children in a transitional housing. We have a refugee protection area where we help them go through the refugee process. We have a very strong youth network women's program. Like, we try to do a holistic approach to serve people with precarious migration. When the COVID came, the pandemic, and everything shut down, the first thing that we were looking was how we can maintain the doors open. Because as happened, we receive people every day. It's more or less between 30 to 60 people coming to our door. And also was a shutdown, not just business or organization, also the borders. And in that case, people were coming in an irregular way, and how we can support them. When the government announced about the emergency fund, as usual, they were left out. And how we, as an organization with other organizations, we start doing advocacy work, because we are located in Toronto, with the city of Toronto, that to respond to them. And when I say the vulnerable communities that they were left out, we can say refugee claimants, well, now they call asylum seekers, refugee claimants, victims of or survivors of human trafficking, that they are not born in Canada or they don't have a status in Canada, undocumented persons, temporary foreign workers, migrant workers, students, and visitors. And we start looking how to respond to this. And we start seeing that people, the way that to communicate is with technology, but also the challenges that they will have with the technology. And the other is that we were seeing that more and more we were receiving calls about the if there was a gender violence, and because they were isolated, they were nowhere to go. And what we did is that we went to the city of Toronto and started looking how we can support them. We start with gift cards to distribute it. Secondly, we start looking how to provide food, because most of the people without status, they were left out with no salaries and they didn't have access to the emergency fund. And many of them, because they were in the frontline workers, they were facing the situation of COVID. And what we managed to do was that we had a temporary, what we call COVID fund, that was to provide funding to the communities when they were with COVID. We start doing webinars in Zoom, and it's very interesting because now we're still doing Zoom webinars, because help us to really have access to their own houses. We start doing virtual English classes, and in the English classes, in the programs, help to start giving, especially there were a lot of women with children, what are the rights, to start giving in the English classes kind of safety parts, where to look help, how to start looking for immigration, like information about immigration, because one of the threats is that, especially if you have been brought by your partner, is that they will inform to immigration, and how we were using the English classes as a way to get to their homes. Also, we were doing food distribution, and we really collect with volunteers that we were distributing food, but also protections, PPEs. But we have a primary care clinic for people uninsured. And what we did, we started doing, because people without status were afraid to go to the big places to get the vaccine. And they start asking if we were doing the vaccination. And we did the vaccination in which, like we managed to vaccine like more than 1,000 people without status. But what I wanna say, because I need to finish, because I believe my 5 minutes is almost done, is that what we try is that we were advocating with the city and start knocking the doors to see how they can have access. But at the end, they came, the city, because was the city of Toronto, but the communities is the ones that at the end of the day came all in their shoulders, because that's how we respond as a community, because the government, the federal government, didn't really saw the intersectionalities that anyone have, and they didn't even look on especially with the gender-based analysis, but especially with women with precarious migration. And I leave it there.
Thank you so much, Lily. So like I said, a great panel, great folks doing work on the ground so far. So we're going to go into our moderated question period, and then we will go into our public question period. So for now, I think one of the things that we were talking about when we were all together is that we wanted to find out what were some gaps that you've seen, Loli and Eileen, in emergency response when dealing with Black, Indigenous, racialized, and refugee women and gender diverse people. And how did you step in to fill those gaps? What was that like for you? And whoever would like to go first.
I'll start, I'll share. So first, what we did, which affects women and all of the community, is applying for funding through Indigenous Services Canada and allowing to, hopefully, you know, you get your funding, and because the first thing is a lack of funding, so we had to access more. And then some of the gaps, the other gaps were, like I said, when we did have an evacuation, there was nothing in place for business continuity. So we had to incorporate that into our plan, and then utilize other people to help out. And there was also a lack of education and awareness and training programs in our First Nation, specific to First Nation and my First Nation, including First Nations community have identified a need for employing their own emergency management coordinator. This is something that we've never had. I've only taken on the added role of on my job to do that, and so I've since applied for one. So I'm waiting to hear. I keep my fingers crossed. I'll let Lola share. Thank you.
What we see is that with the gaps, one is, I'm totally agree with Eileen, resources. As usual, the resources with people without status is really low. There is no resources from either provincial or the federal government. In the city of Toronto, there is very low the resources, but that's one element. But also the other was when they were having all these emergency meetings, they didn't see how the immigration status will make an impact on them. For example, if you didn't have the social insurance number with number 9 was more a temporary social insurance number to do with your taxes, you didn't have access to the emergency fund. But they didn't look as another options. Also, the other is that they didn't see is that not everybody speak English and French, and the level of education about the situation with COVID was not all the how can I say, the reading, what they, first of all, reading and not in plain language, but also not to consider that the migrants and people or newcomers, we had relatives in the country of origin, and that was tried to demystify that they cannot go to their country because it was no way to travel, but not to explain why. It was more like they were, you felt like you were in kind of a jail. For example, migrant workers, there were not communications to them that they didn't let them out of the farms to try to control the pandemic, but there were no options for them. How to bring the food, one of the things is that they didn't see that they will be in a very vulnerable situation and a situation of exploitation and abuse. And that's when always happen in an emergency, someone taking advantage on you.
Thank you both for that. I think that's such an important point, especially when we think about emergency responses and not thinking about sort of who is falling through the cracks, right? Like, so Loli, for example, you were talking about people who might not speak either of the national languages, right? The official languages. And about folks who have precarious status or who have no status. Thinking about the way in which CERB or other financial help couldn't be accessed by people who are also doing quite a lot of physical labor and manual labor that a lot of people don't want to do. And Eileen, I think also when you were talking a lot about, I wrote down here, growing pains. I think that's such a good way of describing a lot of what these situations are. I think sometimes it is true that a lot of institutions might forget to ask the questions that are important to ask. But I think it's also kind of, it can't be left to sort of like, okay, well, we'll just figure it out eventually. It has to be part of the plan as we're working. We can't be an afterthought, if anything. So that kind of goes a little bit into the second question around grief and displacement. And this is something that we were talking about, the folks of us in the panel. And we were talking about grief and displacement and how it shows up in multiple ways. So grief, or rather displacement from the home, because you are in an emergency crisis, there's a disaster happening, you can't stay inside the home. But displacement also because of heightened domestic violence and gender-based violence, right? And so there's multiple drivers there of displacement. And then talking about grief and in how it shows up not only because, you know, obviously during the pandemic, there was quite a lot of grief, there was a lot of death, there was a lot of illness, but there was also the grief around not being able to kind of like be gathered in community, not being able to be in your safe space, not being able to do quite a lot of things. And I think particularly there's a particular grief, I think, especially when it comes to a disabling event like the pandemic. And you know, as folks with like autoimmune diseases or immunocompromised people, the grief of seeing people kind of like wanting to go back to normal and them feeling left out again, And so there's a lot that's happening in the area of grief and displacement. So one of the questions that we were thinking about was, how does grief and displacement show up when dealing with crises and disaster, particularly in both of your communities and the communities that you're working with? And what were some of the strategies that both you and your organizations implemented to address these? So I'll throw it back to either Loni or Eileen.
I'll start. So what we did in our community, especially during the pandemic, because that was life-changing experience for everybody, and it really affected the community members of my community, and it affected all ages. So because we knew that we didn't really have like a whole lot of staff that could assist, so I went ahead and hired a counselor, traditional counselor, and a social worker, kind of like a certified counselor in the Western medicine kind of field, Western technology and that aspect. So we gave the option to community members of their choice of whether they wanted to do the Western way or the traditional way. We respected to have that available for them to as their choice. And we also, because we couldn't be around them every day, we asked, like, is it okay if we phone you, like to touch base with the ones especially living alone? And we implemented a color code system in our community, which we gave a package to every household, and each color had a specific name on it. So daily we would have a volunteer team that would ride in the community every day just to check on their windows to say, okay, there's a color there, that means they need something. So that really helped because we had to keep the distance of pandemic. So we wanted to be creative in that aspect, you know, to respect social distancing, but yet know that we were there checking in on them. So there was also rise in substance abuse, family violence, because people were like, you know, not used to being restricted. So they used some of that as substance abuse as a coping mechanism. But then we did also have availability of dispersing traditional medicines. And although we would have liked to have social gatherings, but we couldn't. And it was a lot of one-on-one or a lot of phone calls, a lot of virtuals and just stuff like that, and coping in really difficult situations when family violence rates started increasing, and, you know, helping to assist to, okay, if there was children involved, who was going to look after the children and all of that. It was like really a lot of strategizing and brainstorming and asking for help from our team, our health team, our managers, you know, anything that we could offer was, I looked for, like, because our community health nurse worked days on end, long hours, and I always say kudos to her because she really did a lot for our community. So
I think when we talk about grieving and displacement, I see it in two ways. One is us as a staff, because at the FCJ, we were vast majority, we are people that we are coming from different parts countries. We are, some of us, newcomers, former refugees, and also with the participant, with the clients, the community. And because we see it with the staff, is because the pandemic was around the world and they couldn't even mobilize, and also they were grieving personally to be in Canada, where you can have more access to PPE than in countries like in the regions like it's Africa, Central America, South America, Asia. And that's something that we were seeing on that. At the same time, a grieving because we need to reduce the number of staff and some working from home. And in the meantime, we were putting together all the technology. It was a feeling of guiltiness because people were looking for our help. And that's something that we need to put it in that way. The other is in the community. It is a community that have been uprooted already, that they have been coming and make a claim here, that have been trafficked, that have been in a situation of violence. You already come with that experience and you already have that grieving. And then on top of that is the COVID, and that you cannot mobilize, that you are isolated, that is, if you start seeing, and I'm saying because I am a former refugee, you start getting used to that grieving. Like you try to start moving as a machine. And I can say we were like machines, boom, boom, doing, giving food, giving the gift cards, how to support them, where to send them with shelters. And the shelters reduce the beds. But as a solution, we were doing was we start, even with all the protection, we start bringing staff to the office. We start rotating and to start having meetings to do check-ins. But also with the community, we start doing art therapy. A lot of communication on art therapy, but also one big element. We are talking about adults, and we start seeing children and youth that they are all connected online and no communication and isolation. And what we started doing was very good with the University of Toronto, what we call the music box. And they were receiving classes of music. And we managed to get the donation to send, and they were doing the ukulele, that they were playing an instrument. And that you could see how they react after the tiredness to be in class to do that. And with the youth, what they were doing was playing around with the Zoom. And I think that was one of the reactions to try to start having a kind of in life, but inside with all the limitations that there was given. And I think that's how we have been handling, and was a good experience.
That's amazing. I always love when folks tap back into art to be able to express what is really hard to express in moments of crisis, right? I think a lot of the times we don't really know what's happening. We don't really have, we can't put our fingers on like how it is that we're feeling. We know we're feeling isolated, but there's a lot more to that. And so I think art is a really, really good medium or proponent to be able to help people to kind of like be a little bit more aware of what's going on just within themselves, if anything. Lots of really good conversations there. I think the idea around grief and kind of like and displacement, I think from what I was hearing from Eileen too, and just, how grateful you were to your support staff. One of the things that I think happens quite a lot is that kind of work, care work, gets invisibilized so much. And especially I think in a lot of these emergency plans that are institutionalized, right? Like they don't necessarily think about all of that labor that happens in the back end and how people are not only having to cope with their own issues and like their own feelings, but how Lily put it, right? Where there's also, if you're staff, you also have this sort of like added layer of you're caring for others who are your participants, who are your service users, and you're also trying to take care of yourself and your families and your communities. And oftentimes your communities that you might not be able to access right now for whatever displacement that you're doing or that you are being imposed upon. So there's quite a lot to be said there, and I think it is important for us to kind of always think about like who's not at the table when we're having these conversations, right? And that's definitely something that these emergency plans should have been thinking about. And unfortunately, a lot of the times that labor falls onto the hands of the nonprofit sector, and folks who have a lot less resources and capacity, but who do it because it is for community purposes and to be able to support folks who otherwise would have zero supports. So that goes into our next set of questions. So are there any myths that have shown up in care work in times of disaster and emergencies that you want to debunk? So we've talked a lot about invisibilizing feminized care work. We've talked a lot about, erasure of Indigenous, of Black racialized folks, of trans folks. Is there anything that you want to kind of just shed some light on and say, like, this is a myth and I'm here to debunk it?
Go ahead, Lola.
Yes, I was to say, oh, well, the myth that we have, and it's something that we have been seeing, is that when a newcomer comes to Canada, looks like you just born, and not to understand that we are people that we bring a lot of skills. When is the situation of COVID, people, when we start talking, people start coming and say, here it comes, I want to save them, I want to do this, I want to, and there were a lot of donations, which was welcoming because people wants to do something, but also in a respectful way. That was, we want, because you can help at one point, but sometimes the helping, you are invading on them. Like, for example, the mystify that we have, that we are living in a patriarchal world, but there is a myth that any man coming from Latin America is a chauvinism, which is, I can say, yes, there is a lot of violence, but not the assumption that you were serving a family and to start doing that. And that was one of the challenges because we know that they were isolated. We need to do a lot of education, but not in a way that isolate them more. And that's something that we need to, that we were seeing, that people to try to save the woman because living with a macho man, how to help them to get out, and in that way to put it in a, no in a without understanding the different cultures. The other element that I would like to demystify was that we saw it with the racialized community and also with the Latin American communities, that we are coming from places where at one point we have been used as a guinea pigs in a way that trying to, without knowing, they give the contraceptions needles, and you don't know that you have been even totally like, because you have 4 kids, they do all these surgeries to try to stop that. And when you come and start telling them, well, here comes a vaccine, and start saying this is a vaccine that appears in 3 months or 6 months, how you can to explain them to really that is something good to try to protect the whole community, not just the individual. And that was one of the elements that was a lot of work from our organization with the community, which was to gain trust. And we already have something in advantage that we have been working for more than 32 years with the community, and they have trust on us. And that's how we start demystifying all the myth coming about the vaccine and to start helping them. And that's why I said we did like 18 vaccine clinics, and especially for people without status, and was successful because we knew how to present the situation, and also to respect. If they don't want to be vaccinated, well, it's their choice. And that's how you can present. And I think it's something that we need when you are in a case of emergency. You need to have, again, I'm coming back with the intersectionalities, because as I say, I'm a woman, I'm from El Salvador, I'm also a grandmother, a mother, but also I feel like I'm Canadian, and you need to understand that, all the difference. And also I can say I'm a privilege because I'm look a little bit white, but if I don't open my mouth, I can pass by. But what I'm trying to say is that we didn't have that analysis in any government of level of government at the beginning, until they start seeing the rejection of the vaccine or rejection of all related to COVID. They start looking that in the city of Toronto, and that's how they start looking all that intersectionalities.
Eileen, over to you.
So in terms of the debunking racialized stereotypes, I'll speak about Indigenous people and natural disasters, because it's too often that we hear of negative comments about First Nations communities when they have to be evacuated from their communities due to a natural disaster. And we all know that in Northern Ontario, every year, the far coastal communities are affected by the breakup of the winter, the ice, and they get flooding. And they also experience natural disaster through forest fires as well. And the myth of people commenting that, oh, First Nations people always need, want, like, it's not a handout. And, you know, these are people's lives that we're talking about. And I think that, you know, if there's more education and awareness out there, and it's a way of having a positive outcome in ensuring that, you know, this is something that will probably have to happen every year until, you know, it's not like some of those communities can just up and move their community to a newer location. It's not that easy, you know, it's costly, and it's finding that land base that we don't even know would exist for a community to have a choice in moving. And the other one is with the pandemic, we all know that food was scarce. Food security became a reality in not just First Nations, but in rural municipalities as well, urban areas. And you know, a lot of us were affected because of the pandemic, and the coastal communities. Again, I will speak. I really have. I feel for them, because everything is so costly for them to live where they do live, and to have access to good food is very costly for them. Where it's different for me, that I live an hour away, but I still do have access to way lower costs in food prices than what they would pay for in their own communities. So the myth about that is that, you know, maybe we do need to support one another and address it in a racial point of view that, you know, could benefit all of Canadians to open their hearts and minds to find a better solution.
Thank you both. what I'm hearing a lot is that really there's a lot of assumptions that are made, right? So I'm hearing the assumptions that from Loli saying that people assume that violence is cultural, which we all know that it isn't. It is structural and it is about power. It is not because you are from a specific community that all of a sudden you are now more prone to violence. Another assumption that I'm hearing too, and this is from Eileen, is that, you know, the assumption of folks who don't live in a particular community who are like, oh, well, have you tried doing X, Y, Z, thinking that they already have the answers, and asking people to, you know, entirely uproot themselves to a totally different community without any consideration for the logistics, the cost, if that even makes sense. So I thank you both also for thinking through this question with me around kind of like what are some things that you kind of want to demystify when we're talking about emergency planning and crisis management. And that really ties in really well to our last point. But before that, one of the things that I forgot to mention was that the fear of vaccine was very real for Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. And that's directly tied to a lack of trust in institutions. And the first thing that, you know, comes to mind for me, at least, is forced sterilizations in all of these communities, right? We've seen forced sterilizations that have happened all over the globe, but also within North America, within Indigenous communities, within Black communities, within racialized communities. And that really has sort of a eugenics model of like who is worthy of giving life and who isn't. And so, as Loli like put it very well, you know, there's a lot of assumptions that are kind of made as to why certain people might not be okay with accepting something from the institution right away. And that's why, you know, like one of Eileen's responses was to obviously bring, you know, like a race and cultural lens to this, right? Like we need a critical race lens to a lot of the work that's happening. And that's obviously missing in quite a lot of the institutionalized planning that goes on. And so before I go into our last moderated question, I just also want to remind folks that if you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And once we go to the Q&A portion, I will start sifting through those and we will be able to answer them. So for the last question, in times of crisis, obviously we've been talking about this, many people who are distanced or are removed from the situation, right? They're not even close to Eileen's community, for example, or they're not related at all in terms of the work that Loli is doing with refugee folks, but they want to spring into saviorism, which is often more harmful, and it really evokes a lot of colonial legacies, right? We're thinking about people who just want to spring into action and they're like, I just want to help, without realizing or potentially realizing that they could cause more harm than good. So for the panelist, you know, one of the things that I wanted to know was how does this show up in your work, and how do you deal with it?
Eileen, do you want to answer first? Or?
Okay. So in dealing with a situation like this, I'll relate it back to my evacuation experiences. So what we did was we had a partial and a total. So when we were doing the partial, because we got the most vulnerable people out, which was our prenatals, our elders, other chronic illnesses that people had that should warrant being close to a hospital. So in dialoguing with the provincial operations emergency center, when we initiated the declaration, kind of opens the doors to communicating with all partners, all stakeholders. And so the city of Timmins, I'm going to say the city of Timmins because that's where we were going. And my experience with that was they were really willing to help us, but we also knew that our community was very strong in emergency management, and we wanted to be the ones in charge of our own community. So we kind of eliminated the process of having the city of Timmins come in and help us, because they wanted to displace our most vulnerable, because we had a few elders and they were going to send one elder to the next town, one elder 200 kilometers away, the other elder maybe 300 kilometers away, because they couldn't all be together in a long-term care setting. So we said no, because this would cause more harm for them. And we appreciated that, you know, they did the offering and trying to help us, but so we took control and saying, no, we were going to take care of our own. And that it was important for us to stay together. And because then we're going to have more problems with mental health, grief, the whole 9 yards kind of thing. And people with their families that were left behind, they would be worried about their loved ones being so far away and how they're doing. And we just did not want to cause any more chaos for them. And so that was an experience in itself. And since then, we have made a stance that our First Nation has control over what we do. And I think it's it's a positive. And when you talked about colonialism, that, you know, for years, like, you know, First Nations were colonized. So this is a way of empowering our First Nations and decolonizing our situations in how we are putting those plans together, emergency response plans, so that it's incorporated that, okay, this is the process that we're going to do and for what reasons. And basic number one reason is to keeping our own. So me watch.
Well, I'm totally agree, Eileen, that the important is that how we can have a control in our own communities and to provide. But with us in the community, paternalism is always there, because we have been uprooted. We come here to a country that we don't know the whole culture, what is the information, and people, instead to give you the tools, they try to tell you what to do. And one of our, how with the pandemic was getting worse than usual. And one of the things is that, and we are coming from countries in the global south, that colonialization is still there, and we're still being colonized, because it's still going to exploit the lands. And that's what uproot people to come to looking for a safe place. And what we do is that we have a policy that we provide tools. And we try to explain, even in our trainings with the staff, but also with the volunteers, that everybody, we are human beings and we are the same. And if you are going to support, is just to provide information in a way that the person can take their decision and their choice. And one, I can give an example about when it's a domestic violence situation, we give them like what is the safety plan to leave the situation. And because it's a cycle, a lot of time, because there is not enough resources that they can feel safe, they go back with the abuser. And instead to reject, we say, that's okay. Is that happen? We are still open to receive you come, and we continue providing, inviting them to the different activities, because we understand that we are coming from countries where always they have been, I can say, they've been colonized all the time, being invasive from the Western countries, and to tell us what to do. And now in our organization, what we try is to say, no, this is our information, and this is your choice. Because one of the challenges was with a lot of people without status, they were pushing them, and especially, which is understanding the systemic pressure from the shelters, that they need to do something with immigration, and they were not ready. And we have that like a clash with that system, because we were saying, no, wait, the person is not ready. Let them to make the decision. And when they are ready, we are here to support them. And that's how we see that is more like to provide the information. But that's what the experience that we have been living since always.
Yeah, definitely. I think obviously colonization has done a number on so many of us and continues to do quite a lot of harm. And we see those legacies, right? We see the legacy around not being given agency as to not even being able to do what's good for our communities, but having the assumption that we don't even know what that looks like. Which again, speaking about paternalism, speaking about a bunch of other things, also if there's an element of gendered labor, there's a lot of gendered assumptions there as well. So one of the things that I was hearing also is that from Eileen was basically like, thanks, but no thank you. And I think that's such an empowering, it's so empowering to be able to like push back to institutions. It is very hard to do quite a lot of those times. And a lot of the times, not only is it hard, but it can also be a little bit violent to be able to push back against institutions, the violence around like getting the violence back from institutions. But when you are able to take that back into your own hands, like talk about empowerment, right? Talk about being able to say like, we got this, we know what's best for us. Please don't think that you can come in here and decide, you know, to divide all of our elders all over the place without any support system in place, without even knowing where the other folks are going to land or where they're going to be. And just like further create isolation, right? Like social isolation and things like that. And from both of you, I also heard around, you know, continuously like not being told what to do, right? And I think that's such an important piece, like especially folks who are not part of Black, Indigenous, or racialized communities. It can be very easy to kind of feel like, oh, but I have solutions, I have thoughts, but I think it is so important to be able to step back and just figure out what your role is in this. Is your role to be alongside somebody? Is your role to be behind somebody and support them? Or is your role to not be in the room at all and just leave and the space for it to just be ours? So I think those are some things that need to be reckoned with a little bit more when we're talking about thinking around a critical race lens to gendered questions of labor, of care work, of crisis management that happens that like leave so many of us in the lurch. So again, this has been very, very great in terms of conversations. So now we're going to turn it over to the audience question and answer period. And I'm going to go ahead and read the first question that came through. So somebody asked, Eileen mentioned taking a training. Just wondering if she minds sharing where she found training and the funding for costs.
So the training that I had attended, which no longer exists, was through First Nations Technical Services Incorporation. They used to deliver all the 4 pillars of emergency management training. And but now there is a new company that I'm not exactly sure what the acronym stands for, but it's ISN MACWA. And they do have an upcoming training session being held in Sault Ste. Marie in April, and it is free. They will take care of your accommodations and meals, but it's up to the participant to provide their transportation to get there. So those are the ones that I know of right now. And the other ones that we often will take are the ones from the University of British Columbia. And they have a whole bunch of emergency management modules online that you can also access. Thank you.
Perfect. I just forgot to unmute myself for a second. We are still in these Zoom eras. One thing that I wanted to ask folks around, I'm also waiting to see if there are going to be more questions, oh, there's just a question that came through, just kidding. It feels like we're in a crisis era, pandemic, climate, economic security. How do you avoid getting bogged down? Where do you find hope? I like how we all made the same face.
I think it's a collective, with the community. And I can say, like, it's not just in the pandemic, like last Friday, when the government of Canada expanded the Safe Third Country Agreement to the land border and to try to avoid and send back people to detention or to to United States. It's really frustrating and bring you down. But when you are in a collective, that's where I see hope. Or when you have, like you have been working in cases and then they come and they have been successful. And with that big smile is a big hope. But I still believe we are in humanity, and especially in women, and how in our solidarity that we say we walk shoulder to shoulder in a way that we can become like a wall to really continue with all these crises made by the systems.
For me, I would say that we acknowledge and celebrate the small accomplishments that people make. And it's important to validate those little things, and it makes a big impact. And it changes the environment, I believe, and it, like, you know, it will boost your own mental wellness. And for what do? I tend to do a lot of my own, I like reading, and spending time with my traditional practices is a place of my own peace, special place. And it's what we can offer now for our community members. And a lot of them are doing they're relating back to all of their traditional practices and activities, and it really, really gives them, it holds a warm place in their hearts. It's just taking that time for yourself in recognizing that our own self-care matters as well as helpers. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. What a wonderful question to end this Q&A period on. I think hope can look like many things. It can look like big hope, and it can look like small hopes, right? I think, you know, both of you spoke to the hopes you have for your communities, but also the hopes that you have individually, which I think is really important to not forget about, you know, how we are part of an ecosystem, right? And we kind of like feed into each other. And you really can't pour from an empty cup. And so you always have to remember to fill your own cup so that you make sure that, you know, the work that folks dealing with crisis, dealing with a lot of disaster and emergencies, what Eileen does, what Loli does, what other folks who are listening in do, it's intense work, it's care work. One of my hopes is that folks who do care work get less invisibilized and get paid better, because that is important and that is necessary. So we'll end it there for the Q&A portion. Thank you folks for your questions. In terms of what's next, I'm going to pass it over to Adriana Contreras, who is going to be sharing her work with us. She's been diligently taking notes and making illustrations. She is a graphic recorder. And so Adriana, take it away.
Hello, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be here with all of you, listening to Eileen and Loli, learning from what they've shared with us. When I started to think about this drawing, I thought of it as a journey, that this work of disaster and emergency management, it's an ongoing process. And as it was mentioned throughout, it requires ongoing and emerging strategies for needs that are going to continue evolving. And we've come out of, or are still coming out of the pandemic. We are seeing the aftermath and what needed to be in place for everyone to stay safe. And obviously there was more work and more required for many of our communities because of the things that were shared during the conversation. Along the path, when you see this again, I'll be working on this more and refining the drawing. So when you receive this drawing, along the path, you'll see that there are some key elements that were mentioned that are essential for this work. One of the ones that was mentioned was putting culture as part of the safety plan. When we are destabilized and we're facing something that is so challenging that is creating trauma, something that can be a way of rooting or finding peace is going back to our cultures and going back to our knowledge and to our practices. And that is so closely tied to mental health and mental health supports that are based also in culturally relevant practices. And all of this couldn't happen if the basic needs are not met. But also being able to know and to communicate to people very openly what their rights are and what resources are available. And that was mentioned in some of the existing gaps that you can see more like in the middle of the page. The fact that people have not been able to reach resources because of language barriers, and not just language like official languages, but also the way things are written or expressed, or even where they're published. And also how funding is available but is not made available for everyone. So there's too many barriers to access the most minimum support that has been put forward either by provincial or the federal government. Two things I want to also highlight, actually three. One was the conversation around grief and how it compounds. That is not a single grief. It's kind of building up on previous griefs, either by loss of connection to our communities. For many of us as immigrants, our disconnection to land, and knowing that in the places where we're from, people are going through an even harder time because of lack of resources and ongoing colonialism. But that as we continue to prove over and over again, when the system fails us, we respond as a community, and that is our strength. And within that, at the bottom left, you will find two phrases that were shared, that we have to continue reminding whoever doesn't believe it that we cannot be an afterthought, that our needs need to be put first, and also that we find hope in our collective action and solidarity. And it looks pretty small in the drawing, but it'll be larger when you see it again. The importance of making care labor or care work more visible. And this, I've been seeing this come up more and more in different spaces that I've been in, and even talking about the way we work with one another and we relate to one another is to bring care at the forefront. So we are creating braver spaces to talk about things that are difficult, but we're also needing to create more caring spaces where we can continue to uplift our well-being and make it the center of whatever action we decide to take. I think I'll leave it there, but I am again very honored to be here with all of you, and I hope that that this drawing can be a reminder or a memento or a place to go back to some of the learnings that were so gratefully shared with us today. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Adriana, for that. That was wonderful. There's a lot of love for you in the chat as well. Talk about, adding art into some of the stuff that we're doing, right? Like, again, art is really, really important. One of the things that I want you to do, Adriana, is that if you want to leave your contact information in the chat in case people ever want a contact for a graphic artist, please do, so that people know where to reach you and can continue to use your wonderful art. And we're excited to see what the final look is going to look like. So that is it. It is 5:53. Thank you so much I just want to give a big round of applause to our panelists over Zoom, obviously. So thank you, everyone. Loli, thank you so much for all of your knowledge. Eileen, thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us. You both do such tremendous work. And it's really wonderful to see that some communities are really better off because you're part of them. And so thank you so much for your work. And thank you, Adriana, for that beautiful work that I can't wait to see finished. And I will pass it back to Dorothy.
And thank you, Elderly. You conducted, that's the word I'm looking for, this panel so beautifully. It was so human-centered. Your voice is so posed, and let me say it in French. I think it will come better in French.
What I want to say is that you manage to take very difficult challenges, very polarizing, very hurtful issues, and you made the conversation really human and inspiring. And of course, thanks to Eileen and thanks to Loli, it was even more impactful. And especially, of course,
the
thanks
four
to
of you
Adriana.
made this conversation so human-centered, and you said it all beautifully, or it was really like challenging to say that the hope sometimes is not always there. We get tired. Alderly said at some point that you cannot give out of an empty cup. And it was beautiful, beautiful. So thank you to all. I can see that within the chat, people have appreciated your words. And I'll come back to you, Adriana. This is so beautiful. I mean, I've never seen that, being into such a deep, intense conversation, and you bringing so beautifully art into that context. And I'm sure that whatever we'll be seeing tomorrow is going to bring the conversations even further, and it's going to allow maybe those people who were not here today to embrace the comments, to embrace the words that were said today. So thank you, Adriana. Thank you, Aldalee. Thank you, Loli. And thank you, Eileen. So this is going to be the end of our day today. So we had a packed afternoon. Right now, what we want you to do, obviously, is to go into the chat box, sorry, and take a few minutes to complete a short survey. It's important for us to know how your day went. If there's anything that you want to pinpoint, anything that you want to bring to our attention, you can do that through the survey. Beside the panelists, beside our host, Aldalee, I also like to thank the accessibility team and obviously all of you, the audience. Without you, there would be no summit. So thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us today.
So just a quick reminder, the summit will carry on tomorrow. We'll begin our Zoom session with the same link as today, and we'll start at 12:30 Eastern sharp, 12:30 p.m. sharp Eastern time. As of 1 p.m., we will be welcoming 3 extraordinary women who are professionals in emergency management. They are also feminists, and they're amongst the very rare professionals that work in emergency management with an intersectional approach. So tomorrow we'll learn exactly what work they've done, because they've worked on a toolbox in cooperation with the Canadian Foundation for Women. And this toolbox was built to take into account gender-based violence. And that will help your organization or your organizations to identify the strategies that are essential to strengthen your own strategies against tragedies and emergencies. So we hope that you'll be with us tomorrow. And if you know people that were registered and did not attend today, we encourage you to call them, write to them, invite them to come back tomorrow.
Following that workshop, we'll host our second live stream plenary session from Ottawa, where Paulette Senior, President and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation, will be in conversation with representatives from community organizations nationally who have been on the front lines of the pandemic response and recovery. So we look forward to seeing you all back here tomorrow. So before we leave, if you want to leave in the chat 1 word or 2 saying what is your key takeaway, how you felt about this event, please do so right now as we're closing down. And don't forget to fill in the short survey, because it's important for our team to know how you felt during the afternoon and your key takeaways. So thank you so much for being here. Merci à vous tous d'avoir été ici et on se retrouve demain. Bonne fin de journée. Bye bye.